Hello, my dear students. Today we will study the first chapter of 11th class textbook Hornbill. The title of the chapter is The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. In this chapter, we have the theme of innocence, friendship, love, connection, kindness, selflessness, respect, and acceptance. It is narrated in first person by an unnamed narrator, and the story is a memory piece. And it is later, after reading the story, the reader realizes that Khushwant Singh may be exploring the theme of innocence. Khushwant Singh was born on the 2nd of February 1915, and he expired on the 20th of March 2014. He was an Indian writer, an author, a lawyer, a diplomat, journalist, and a politician. He produced some of the most provocative and admired English language fiction and non-fiction in post-World War II in India. His debut novel, Train to Pakistan, was acclaimed for its exploration of the bloody violence between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs during and shortly after the 1947 partition of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. Grandmothers, in fact, grandparents for that matter, have a very special place in our hearts. Our relationship with them is a treasure, and they're an epitome of love and selflessness. They adapt, they accept change, they're full of experience, and it is these experiences that help them form certain beliefs. And that is why, maybe at times, my dear children, we might find them a bit stubborn. But we must not mistake this adamant behavior for lack of love. They are concerned, and that is why they express themselves in the best way they know they can. The Portrait of a Lady is written in first person, and it's a biographical mode. It's the perception of Khushwant Singh of his own grandmother through his own eyes. And the theme that this chapter covers is generation gap and the need to celebrate those childhood years. The fact that generation gap is not an unsurpassable gulf is characterized by the fact that a wave of nostalgia overpowers us when we think of the simple and serene days of our childhood spent with our grandparents. We might grow up and grow apart, but the morals and the principles instilled in us by the older generation refuse to die. As we grow up, various tasks and interests attract our attention, leaving us with little time to realize that we might be the only interest of our grandparents. If the birth of a grandchild leads to boundless joy for grandparents, is a reality in every nook of the world, it is also true that the grandchildren's attention will invariably be taken over by other things pretty soon. We end up being so busy at times that those silent steps the old ones take to retreat from our lives are rarely noticed. And what about the second theme? The theme of celebrating childhood. The story by Khushwant Singh is an attempt to celebrate those childhood years spent with his grandmother when the simple pleasures of chanting a prayer song or feeding the dogs kept both of them busy. There might not be anything dramatic in their routine, but the way she took care of the smallest of his needs and worked for his education shows the depth of their relationship. The story is written in first person and it's in a biographical mode. It is a perception of Khushwant Singh of his grandmother through his very own eyes. So let us study the chapter, and I hope you must have read it before approaching this video. Before you listen to this video, I would like all the students to read the whole chapter without any explanation from my end and develop a perspective. Because children literature is all about developing a perspective. I don't want to condition your minds. I want you to understand whatever content is in any chapter with your own bright minds. So every chapter may be dealt in a different manner, but this is one chapter that I would like you to read through thoroughly before you visit this video. So assuming whatever explanations I give right now, I will be assuming that you have read the chapter. So on this first page, there are specific things that have been underlined. These specific things, these specific lines are very important from not only the exam point of view, but also to understand what was on Khushwant Singh's mind when he was writing about his beloved grandmother. So let us understand what does he mean when he said what was hard to believe. It was very hard to believe that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband. Why was that so? Because she was known to Khushwant Singh as a very old, wrinkled lady for the last 20 years that he had known her. In another way, we can say Khushwant Singh could not have ever imagined her grandmother to be anything else but old and wrinkled. This portion describes the grandfather, and the grandfather is a character whom Khushwant Singh has never met in his life, and that description is given here in a very, very vivid manner. He was a person who wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. Remember, this is all set up in Punjab. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He didn't look like the sort of the person who could have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. Now, as he describes his grandfather over here, he goes back to his grandmother, which is the focal point of the whole chapter. And he says that there was a thought that was very revolting. Revolting meant unpleasant for him to think that how is it possible that my grandmother could ever have been young and pretty? All these 20 years I've known him, she's been old and wrinkled. She often even told about certain things about her life, certain episodes from her life. And those episodes that she shared with them seemed undignified, disrespectful, and very absurd, illogical, and strange. Because what did she describe? She used to tell them that many a times she also used to play games. And what were the games at that time, children? Not video games or online games. These were games like hopscotch, like maybe skipping the rope, or maybe some other street game. So this also seemed to be very absurd to Khushwant Singh. And how did these children treat her stories of her time as they treated it like fables of the prophets she used to tell us. And fables are fictitious stories. They have a moral teaching. Somewhere down the line, she would teach that this would be a part of her routine. And they all used to treat it as if they were just fictitious stories, like any other story of the prophet. So Khushwant Singh goes on to describe how old her grandmother was. And he makes a very, very different and a very intriguing comment that she could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. So you can say that she was maybe not that pretty to the eye, but to the heart, she was a pure soul. And she was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. This meant that the way snow capped mountains would exude pure white serenity, calmness, tranquility, peace, so did she. She also transmitted tranquility and pure peace. Children, when you sit with your grandmother, these are the feelings that you have. You feel very content and relaxed with her. And so did Khushwant Singh. There's a reason why he describes her as a winter landscape in mountains because she has pure white hair and she wears a spotless white sari. And that's how she's hobbling around across the whole house. And the moment you sit with her, you feel so calm and relaxed. Now, this paragraph over here is that portion of the chapter which describes the relationship that the grandmother and Khushwant Singh shared, and this is in specific the relationship they had in the village. How were the narrator and the grandmother good friends in the village? The grandmother used to wake him up every morning and get him ready for school. She would bathe him, dress him up, give him breakfast, get him his slate and ink pot, and accompany him to school. While he learnt at school, the grandmother used to read scriptures in the temple. And when the school was over, they would walk back home together and feed the village dogs on the way. Now, there's a beautiful description about the relationship of the grandmother and Khushwant Singh while they were in the village. And as times changed, one had to evolve. And the parents were comfortably settled in the city. They called for Khushwant Singh and his grandmother to join them. And that was the turning point of their friendship. Why was it a turning point of their friendship? Because their arrival in the city was actually brought a big difference in their relationship. She no longer accompanied him to school as he used to go by bus. She could not help him in his studies. They saw less of each other, and the common link of friendship was snapped, and the distance grew. So this became the turning point of their friendship. So there were a series of things that happened when they moved to the city. And somewhere down the line, the grandmother learned how to adapt. She had an objection to music being taught. Why did she hate it? She hated it because for her music was indecent. It was meant only for harlots and beggars. Harlots are prostitutes and beggars. Why for beggars? Because they used music to attract alms. And it was not at all meant for gentlefolk. She did not approve of music being taught to children who came from respectable families. She accepted it, but she did her bit of expressing herself, and her way of expression was silence. It meant disapproval. So one phase was in the village, the second was when they moved to the city, and the third was when they came up, when not they came up, but when Khushwant Singh had to go to the university. At that time, he was given a space of his own. He wanted space for himself and he wanted a room of his own. And that was the time when the common link of friendship was snapped. Again, the grandmother accepted her seclusion, isolation, without resignation. And here, resignation means without any retaliation. She merely accepted and adapted to the fact that her grandchild would need space for himself. And she adapted and started keeping herself busy by doing a number of things which are written over here. And what was the happiest moments of the day for the grandmother? It was the time when she fed the sparrows. In the afternoon, she sat in the veranda breaking breads into bits. Hundreds of sparrows would collect around her. Some came and sat on her legs, others on her shoulders, and some even sat on her head. She didn't shoo them away. She smiled. And this used to be the best moment of the day for her. All these 100 little birds created a veritable bedlam of chirpings. Veritable is a bit is confusing, and veritable is that sound of confusion of chirping. So the grandson has grown up. He first had to study, so he needed some space. He got a separate room. And then he had decided to go abroad for studies. Now, there was a possibility the grandmother would become upset, but that was not the case. She was concerned. That's why she came to leave him at the railway station. But her way of showing concern was different, simple. She didn't talk, she didn't show any emotion. And all she did was praying, and she gave her grandchild a moist imprint on his forehead. Now he says that it was most probably the last sign of physical contact between the author and the grandmother, the narrator and the grandmother. That was so because the narrator thought that at her age one could never tell whether he would find her alive after 5 years because he had gone away for study. So the possibility that she might die within those 5 years was very high. Now, after 5 years, he would expect that she may not be there, but she was still there and she didn't look even a day older. And she was so happy again. She didn't have any time for words. And she hugged him, recited her prayers as usual. This also shows that she was very religious. Throughout the story, we find that she's all the time telling the beads. And on the very first day of his arrival, her happiest moments were with her sparrows. That was the happiest moment. And she used to spend time, and light-hearted scoldings were meted out to the sparrows. That was her expression of happiness. But in the evening, she became ill because there was something else that happened. She called every friend of hers, the women from the neighborhood, and she started singing certain songs of homecoming. And that was a celebration of her son's homecoming, her grandson's homecoming. The grandmother was overjoyed at the homecoming of her grandson, and she collected the women of the neighborhood, beat drums, sang for hours about the homecoming of warriors, and first time in her life, she even forgot to pray. There was a certain change that overtook her when, by the evening, when her grandson had returned, and she suddenly stopped talking before her death because she had taken ill and she had mild fever. The doctor told her that she would be all right, but the grandmother knew that somewhere down inside her end was near, and she felt guilty that she had not prayed last evening. And that was the reason she didn't want to talk to anybody any longer, because she did not want to waste any more time talking to them and instead spend time praying. What could have been the cause of the grandmother's falling ill? Well, when the author came back from abroad after 5 years, the grandmother had collected women from the neighborhood. She kept singing, thumping a drum for several hours. This overstrained body and this overstrained her body, and she fell ill. Well, remember the happiest time of her day used to be the time spent feeding the sparrows. And those sparrows had also developed some kind of a relationship with the grandmother. And how did they mourn the death of the grandmother? Because the grandmother dies, as we are told that she stopped speaking to the family members because she realized that her end was near, and ultimately, while saying her prayers, she did pass away. So the sparrows also mourned the death of the grandmother. Hundreds of sparrows gathered around the dead body. They did not chirp, they didn't touch the breadcrumbs that were thrown to them. They seemed to mourn her death in silence and fly away when her body was taken away for cremation. I want you to understand, children, these are not just one or two sparrows. We're talking about hundreds of sparrows sitting in the courtyard and not even chirping, even for once. So I want you to behold what view it was for the narrator who must have witnessed this. And this was stayed for him forever. He wrote this down. How can you say that the grandmother was a kind-hearted woman? Well, the grandmother was a kind-hearted woman because when she lived in the village, she used to feed the dogs, and when she came to the city, even if there were no dogs there, she took to feeding the sparrows in the courtyard. So this is also depictive that she was a very, very kind-hearted woman. So now, students, let us look at the text questions and see whether we can answer them. Mention the three phases of the author's relationship with his grandmother before he left the country to study abroad. There were definitely three phases. The first phase was when he used to live in the village. The second was when they shifted to the city to join the author's parents. And the third was when the author had to go to the university and was given a room of her own. Now, in the first phase, the grandmother was literally involved in bringing him up. She used to wake him up, get him ready for school, walk to school, come back home together. They had a very, very strong relationship. It was in the second phase when they had to shift to the city and when the author had to share the same room. That became the turning point in their relationship. Because even when they had the same room at that time, the grandmother could not involve herself in the author's day-to-day activities. She could not participate in the manner in which the author's studies in school went on. She could not accompany him. So these were the reasons why this was a turning point also in their relationship. The third phase was, as I told you, when he was given a room of his own. The common link of friendship snapped. She became quieter and private, and she kept spinning the wheel all day long. She would feed the sparrows once a day, and this was the only thing that made her happy at that time. There were two reasons why the grandmother was disturbed when he started going to city school. First was that she could not accompany him. Second was that they were teaching no scriptures, nothing about God. And the third most important thing was that they were teaching music, which she totally disapproved of because she believed that it had very, very lewd associations. The third question asks, what were the three ways in which the author's grandmother spent her days after he grew up? One was the spinning the wheel, second was feeding the sparrows, and the third was telling the beads of the rosary. That means she was a very religious woman and therefore she spent most of her time praying. The odd way in which the author's grandmother behaved just before she died. She had stopped talking to the family members. That was very odd just before she died because she believed that somehow she had forgotten to pray and she had fallen ill because of overexerting herself. But she realized that her end was near and she didn't want to waste any time and wanted to just pray. What were the ways in which the sparrows expressed their sorrow when the author's grandmother died? It was a sight to behold, I believe. Imagine hundreds of sparrows sitting in the courtyard and not chirping, not even a sound. And what was their way of paying homage to this old lady with whom they had built a relationship? They took no notice of the breadcrumbs thrown to them, and neither did they chirp even a little bit till the grandmother's body was removed from the courtyard. So now let's talk about a certain set of questions again in the textbook. And had we been together, we would have discussed it. So I'm just going to give a point of view. You may differ from it, children. So the first question asks, the author's grandmother was a religious person, and what are the different ways in which we come to know about this? So you can say that when she was living in the village with the author, she used to sing prayers in such a manner that she wished that someday her grandchild would learn them. And when she used to accompany him to school, she would visit the temple that was attached to the school every day. She would sit there and read the scriptures. Later, when they moved to the city, she would carry the beads of the rosary with her all the time. She would continuously chant her prayers, and her hands were always telling beads. And she disapproved of the fact that there was nothing about God and scriptures that was taught in the school. And most of her time was chanting prayers, especially towards the end of her days. She had decided not to talk to anybody and waste time, and in fact spend more time in praying. The second question states, describe the changing relationship between the author and his grandmother. Did their feelings for each other change? Well, both of them shared a good bond. She would get him ready for school in the village, accompany him, come back with him later in the day, help him with his studies, teach him prayers by singing the same prayer every morning with an intention that maybe someday he'll learn it up. When they moved to the city, the relationship was a bit strained. He started going to an English medium school. She could no longer accompany him, nor could she help him with his lessons. She didn't like the new school because it never taught God about God and scriptures. And later, when he started taking music lessons, that was something she disapproved of totally because she thought that music had lewd associations with beggars and harlots. And she stopped talking to him afterwards. Somewhere down the line, that does not at the same time mean that she did not love him because because when he left for abroad for studies, she was there. When he came back, she was there, she was happy. So these are things that happen in a relationship. So their feelings didn't change for each other. The point is the involvement might have become less, but the feeling of love, as I told you at the beginning, doesn't ever change. The third question says, would you agree that the author's grandmother was a person strong in character? And if yes, give instances that show this. So, definitely she was a strong person. She had her own opinion about what schools should be teaching, and she considered learning scriptures was better than studying science or English or even music. She didn't like music being taught. She had her own perspective about that and opinion about that, that music was for low level people and it was not for anybody that belonged to a respectable family. That was a strong belief she had. And when the author had gone to the university, she accepted her isolation with resignation. She did create a hue and cry. She found out a way to keep herself busy, spin the wheel, chant prayers, tell the bees, feed crumbs to the sparrows. So she had her own way to keep herself busy. She was not weak that she would start crying all the time. And when she sang the homecoming of warriors for hours and didn't stop, that was her choice. That was a strong decision she made. And towards the end of her days, she had also made another decision that she would not talk to anybody. So she wanted to spend the rest of her time praying, even when all the family members had insisted that she must not. So this also shows a strong, all these points show that she was definitely a woman with a very, very strong, determined demeanor.